Hello everyone, now you will hear a brief summary of the movie Unforgiven. Enjoy watching. Ruth Slater is released after a 20-year prison sentence for a heinous crime. She is met by Vincent, a man who advises her on what not to do if she wants to stay out of prison. It's crucial for her not to harm her victim's family, as many people suddenly start feeling remorse. Using an old photograph, Ruth identifies a man. Vincent offers her a job at a fish processing plant if other employment doesn't work out. Meanwhile, young Catherine falls asleep at the wheel and gets into an accident. Her adoptive parents suggest she live with them until she fully recovers. Vincent drops Ruth off at a rundown house near the dormitory where society's outcasts live. Ruth has to live with 3 rough neighbors, making her prison cell seem more comfortable. During the investigation, Ruth discovers that the victim's son, Steve, is interested in seeking revenge. However, Steve's brother advises him to calm down. Mrs. Malcolm suspects that Catherine's accident might be due to stress, especially since her older sister also went missing the same day. The couple hopes Ruth won't harm Catherine, as she is prohibited from contacting her. Ruth receives a call, and a stranger on the other end threatens her life. When she returns, she finds one of the women going through her belongings, and Ruth punishes her immediately. The drug addict damages the only photo Ruth has of her sister. Kit lives with her seriously ill mother, while her husband and young son stay with his wife. Ruth recalls the events leading to her imprisonment. Her sister was being evicted, and a sheriff's deputy intervened. Ruth shot him with a shotgun. Now, another family lives in the house where the incident occurred. A worker finds small shoes in the wall, a reminder of Ruth's family. Ruth struggles to adjust to life among people, especially in the noisy, overcrowded New York City. She dresses up and applies for a job as a welder but is immediately rejected for obvious reasons. Ruth has no choice but to work at the fish processing plant, where it's dangerous, difficult, and smells awful. Most of her co-workers are migrants or former inmates. A colleague named Blake offers to give Ruth a ride home, but she ignores the offer. They only have 10 minutes for a shower. Ruth goes to the library to use the internet and find her sister. After tweaking the search engine and cross-referencing with birth records, she finds her photos. She discovers that the house where her sister lived has been sold. Ruth gets tense when she sees a stranger in the yard staring in their direction. Ruth remembers that the deputy sheriff, Sharif, was her father's friend and offered her sister to stay with him temporarily. He wanted to resolve the situation peacefully, unlike Ruth's other relatives who planned to break down the door. John, a man from the past, approaches to greet her. She lies, saying she was renovating their house. He offers her to come inside. She vividly remembers living here with her sister and the day the sheriff was shot. Hearing children's voices, Ruth panics and leaves. John offers her a ride to the city. Ruth learns that he is a lawyer and happens to specialize in family law, precisely what she needs. John advises her to stop lying and tell him what happened. Ruth confessed that she lived in the house with her sister after their parents' death. While in prison, she wrote letters to Kate but never received a reply. Now she wants to meet her. John listened to her story and offered his help. Kate suffers from insomnia but refuses to take pills, which hampers her piano playing. She is haunted by childhood nightmares involving an unidentified woman. Ruth finds some interesting construction work, but since no one will hire her, she volunteers to renovate a community center for the homeless, earning only minimum wage. Now she has 2 jobs. Vincent insists that Ruth confess her past imprisonment to her boss, as the ex-con label will follow her for life. At the fish processing plant, Ruth exchanges glances with Blake. The next time, she agreed to get in his car. He was surprised when Ruth got out in a ghetto area, which is now her new home and her second job. She moved her belongings here, although now Kit knows where to find her. Ruth hears some noise and, armed with a key, goes downstairs. She nearly attacks Blake, who simply wanted to treat her to donuts. He apologizes and gives her a warm jacket, as hers is completely worn out. Ruth can't believe someone cared enough to do this. A startled Blake apologizes again and quickly leaves. Once John learned the specifics of Ruth's conviction, he stopped answering her calls. She leaves him a message every day, pleading for help. Finally, Through a coworker named Eliza, Ruth learns who the stranger was and what she did. Kit spends quality time with her brother, and a familiar cop informs him that Kit is still investigating where Ruth works. The brothers are also homeless since their mother turned to alcohol after their father's death. The older brother vividly remembers how terrible it was. Meanwhile, the killer enjoys freedom. Steve, Kit's husband, confronts Kit for letting the criminal into their home. The lawyer takes Ruth's case, but Kit insists that Ruth should never come near their house again. Steve visits his mother for the first time in a long while, but she turns away from him. He looks at their wedding photo. Now he came to see the person who shattered their family. He pretends to be a construction worker to get inside. Ruth notices that the stranger behaves oddly and asks him to leave. But Steve only pretends to leave and waits until they are alone, becoming Ruth's advocate. He finds old photos of Kate and another letter she wrote to her sister. Vincent learns that Ruth hired a lawyer and asks her to abandon the idea of finding her sister. To him, she's a stranger now, and maybe Kate fears her, explaining her silence. In the evening after work, Ruth invited Blake to her place. They grow closer. Mr. Malcolm receives a letter from Ruth's lawyer, shocking him and his wife. Steve tells his brother about his conversation with Ruth. She's doing well, which he finds unfair given her past actions. Unlike the reserved Ruth, Blake, the shirtless guy and friendly neighbor, enjoys every little thing in life. Ruth realizes it's time for Blake to learn the truth. "I recently got out of prison," she says, "for Shariva's deliberate murder." Blake is stunned and doesn't stop her when she leaves the cafe. She nearly bursts into tears but manages to keep her emotions in check, unlike his wife. Mr. Malcolm remains calm. If Ruth approaches her sister, she'll end up back behind bars. He's certain she won't bring anything good into Kate's life. Mrs. Malcolm, however, wants to give Ruth a second chance. At the very least, they should talk to her. Their biological daughter, Emily, overhears the conversation. At the fish processing plant, another co-worker attacks Ruth brutally. Her father was a police officer, and that's why she decided to take revenge on the cop killer. "Remember, watch out, lady, I will get to you," she said. Ruth suspects that Blake told everyone about her. During the fight, Ruth's phone got wet and stopped working. She refuses to talk to Blake and demands he stay away from her. Ruth meets Vincent every week at the same time. The punches were flying wildly, and she couldn't tell what was what. A lawyer named John asked to convey that Kate's adoptive parents agreed to a meeting, so Ruth needed to clean up. The Malcolms accompanied Kate to the rehearsal. Traumatic memories from 20 years ago still haunted her. Ruth managed to hide the signs of beatings and went to meet Kate's adoptive parents. Malcolm assures them that the girl has a stable life and a promising future. Therefore, it's not worth risking it to avoid ruining everything. Besides, Kate doesn't remember her older sister. Ruth gets angry. She raised the girl since birth as their mother died during childbirth, and their father was an alcoholic. Over 20 years, she wrote thousands of letters, not knowing if they were read, burned, or simply torn apart. Ruth rushes because of a couple, demanding to be allowed to meet her sister. The lawyer can't help Ruth anymore, and Emily found those letters and started reading them one after another. Ruth goes mad with anger and helplessness, surrounding the community center, all of which she built with her own hands. Blake eventually persuaded Ruth to listen to him. The fact is, he also served time and was released only a year and a half ago. They're both conditionally free, so just by talking to each other, they risk going back behind bars, and he doesn't spread rumors. Blake apologized again for his reaction in the cafe and left. In the evening, Emily didn't call our heroine, so Ruth asked her for a meeting. The woman continues to watch TV. Emily skipped school to meet Ruth in the park. The girl said that Kate doesn't know anything about her, but sometimes she remembers something. As she leaves, Emily tells Ruth where Kate's rehearsal will take place. Ruth will be able to see her sister. Tiv followed Emily and found out where she lives. At home, Bill's son was in the crib, and his wife was having fun with his brother in the next room. Tiv gently put the child in the crib and beat his brother. And his wife hid behind the baby to stop him from doing anything. In Steve's mother's house, he found an old police pistol. To do everything by the book, Ruth wanted to meet with her lawyer first, but he wasn't at work. So, she came back to her old home. John wasn't home, so Ruth asked for Lise. She remembers how, after Shariva's murder, she stole a car. Unlike her husband, Lise doesn't see in Ruth someone deserving a second chance. She believes the criminal got what she deserved. But Ruth's tears moved her, and she allowed Ruth to tell her what really happened. When they were about to break down the door, Ruth threatened over the phone that she would grab her gun. But it was Kate who grabbed it, hearing that Shariva had entered through the other door. She killed the man back then. Upon learning the truth, Lise decided to help the poor woman. In return, Kate broke her nose, and the older sister brought her to a nearby cafe. "Forgive me for making you do this now," she said. "What to do?" That was the last time they saw each other. Before surrendering to the police 20 years ago, Ruth turned away from the young Kate so she wouldn't see her crying. Now she was close to the Philharmonic when Steve called and said he was holding a gun to Kate's head. They heard a woman's moans from the receiver. The man gave an address to which they would need to come. Ruth asked Lise to give her a lift again. Steve was holding a hostage in one of the buildings near the quarry. Lise learned what had happened and immediately called the police. The assailant ordered Ruth to enter the building. He had a gun pointed at the bound girl. But it wasn't Kate, it was her sister. Steve had mixed up the girls. Kate, as she should have, came to the rehearsal. The criminal ordered the woman to go down on her knees. He planned to kill the girl in front of Ruth. She guessed who was in front of her and what his motive was. Ruth remembers how the sheriff once talked about his sons. They had to give up their bedroom to their sister so that they could live in their house. He was a kind man, trying to convince Steve that it won't get any easier for him. He'll have to leave everything he loves. The man burst into tears and fell to the floor but didn't let go of the gun. At that moment, the building was surrounded by a special forces team. Ruth helped him get up and shielded him with her body. The girl came out. 20 years ago, before surrendering to the police, Ruth turned away from the truth so that she wouldn't see her crying. Now she raised her hands again. Steve didn't shoot at her. They were both arrested and handcuffed. Vincent arrived and asked the cops to release Ruth. Nearby, at the ambulance, were the Malcolms and her younger sister. Vincent nodded to Ruth. Kate went to meet her sister. They hugged. Finally, after 20 years, they were reunited.